Hi there and welcome to Impact Talks. Today we have a great guest. We have Professor Chris Welch. He is a president-elect at the British Interplanetary Society as well as a professor of astronautics and space engineering at the International Space University in Strasbourg, France. I would like you to introduce yourself to our guests, where they might know you from. Please tell us a brief history of what you keep yourself busy with, and take the floor, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. As you've heard, I'm Chris Welch. The first part of the introduction was that I'm president-elect of the British Interplanetary Society. Slightly strange name maybe, but it's the world's oldest space advocacy organisation. It was founded in 1933, so we'll soon be coming up on our 90th anniversary. And you may have heard of such people as Arthur C. Clarke. He was one of the early members and one of my predecessors as the president. So I'm honoured to be following on from him. That's not a paid job though. My paid job is as a professor of astronautics and space engineering at the International Space University in Strasbourg in France, where I direct our MSc in space studies, and I'm head of the Space Payloads laboratory. How did I get here? Well, I was very interested in space from a young age. Arthur C. Clarke, who I just mentioned, was a big part of that. I read a number of his books when I was a teenager. Visions of the Future, for example, was one of those. And I joined, in fact, the British Interplanetary Society when I was a student, around about 18 or 19. So I've been a member for many decades, and therefore privileged to now be the incoming president. I did a physics degree, I did a space physics MSc, I did a PhD in spacecraft engineering. I worked in London at a university there for many years, running an aeronautical and astronautical engineering program. And then 10 years ago, I moved to the International Space University, where I thought that my particular set of skills could be best deployed creating the future space entrepreneurs, the future people who are going to go out and change the space sector. So that's me.
That's something I'd like to discuss as well this podcast, which is space entrepreneurs. We've had a couple of space startups go through a startup funding event. It's always interesting and fascinating what they're working on. I've never been in that industry, and I would like to know maybe from you what it is that is out there nowadays, what it is that you'd like to see coming.
Well, the whole kind of space commerce sector has changed very, very radically over the last 20 years, 10 years even. 20 years ago, I knew the names of every space company in the world because there weren't very many of them, honestly. And now there are so many that it's impossible for me to keep track of them. There are so many people doing interesting, innovative new things, coming up with new business models. I'm pleased to say that ISU has been part of this. Two of the companies that currently have the most satellites in orbit, Planet and Spire Global, both have ISU MSc students as their alumni. But there are so many new possibilities in space. There are particularly possibilities in terms of space data and space applications, but also you see many companies looking at launch, you see many companies looking at in-space operations, a number of companies looking at how to send private payloads to the moon, and indeed beyond. So really the space domain is, I think, coming of age in the 21st century.
What do you think has changed though? Why is it such a huge influx of space entrepreneurship almost?
I think the primary reason for that is that people now realize that there is money to be made in space. The motto of the British Interplanetary Society is from imagination to reality. And of course, 80, 90 years ago, that was about convincing people that it was possible to travel to space at all. Now, nobody, believes that it's not possible to travel to space. I guess in entrepreneurial terms, the question is it possible to make money in space? And I think more and more people are realizing that yes, definitely it is. This is probably a result of two main developments. One, a reduction of the cost of price to orbit, how much it costs to put something in space. But secondly, a development of satellite technology and technology generally, which means how big your satellite needs to be to do something useful. 20 years ago, probably geostationary communication satellites were the prime example of how to make money in space. And these are big satellites. They get put out a long way from Earth in space. Once they're there, you can't service them, you can't do anything with them. So they have to be super high quality, super reliable, and last for 10 to 15 years. What has changed, I would say, is, if you like, a more Silicon Valley approach to space activities, particularly in low Earth orbit, where you can launch a large number of smaller satellites that don't last for so long. But that doesn't matter, because as soon as those satellites are finished, you can launch some new ones, and they've got better technology. So you can imagine if you've got a satellite that you send to geostationary orbit, it's got to be there for 10 to 15 years. That means the technology cycle is quite slow. If you've got something that's going to go into low Earth orbit and it's going to be there for a few years, then you can be constantly improving the technology, constantly improving the capability of those satellites. And I think that's where a lot of space entrepreneurship now comes from. One example of this is synthetic aperture radar. Until a few years ago, it was accepted, wisdom that you needed a big satellite to do synthetic aperture radar. And then a company called ISI came along and showed that actually you could do this with much smaller satellites, and they're flying constellations now of synthetic aperture radar satellites. The interest there is because they can look down through the clouds, they can get pretty good resolution, and they can deliver results very, very quickly for customers on the ground. So everybody is starting to realize.
Can I ask what synthetic aperture radar is?
Okay, yes, good question. Well, I mean, the key thing here is the radar. Don't worry so much about the synthetic aperture. The key thing here is when you're looking at the Earth from space, if you look at it, using normal light, obviously you can only see the surface of the Earth during the day, and obviously you can only see it when there are no clouds. If you're using radar, it doesn't matter whether it's day or night, it doesn't matter whether it's cloudy or not, you can get images of the surface. The resolution, how accurate your picture is maybe not quite so good, but nevertheless it's a whole new capability, particularly with small satellites. And so this sort of technology development is driving all sorts of new business models. There are a lot of very bright, enterprising, young business people, young engineers out there who are looking at the space domain, who are looking at current technology development, saying, how can we leverage these things to find, our niche, to find a way that we can deliver a new service and make money from it. And there's lots and lots of very creative people looking at this.
Don't you find that, obviously from your perspective, you've been a while in the space industry, don't you find that an oversaturation of people that are trying to put satellites in lower Earth orbit, that contributes to, I don't know, of course, that's why I'm asking, but it contributes to space trash, as it calls?
That's a good question. It's certainly a significant issue, what is called space situational awareness, space traffic management, if you like, is an ongoing concern. And I will be honest that I don't think globally we have an answer for this yet. You have companies such as SpaceX and Starlink putting up many, many thousands of satellites. Jeff Bezos and his project Kuiper is looking to do the same. The Chinese have announced their intention to put up their own national constellation of many thousands of satellites. Planet and Spire Global both have a lot of satellites in orbit as well. And so sharing the information there is really very difficult. And a number of these organizations have set up bilateral agreements with other organizations But to my mind, and there was an op-ed piece saying this in one of the space journals, Space News, today or yesterday, that said we need to be far more open to sharing this information collectively. If we're really all going to make good use of space, we have to make sure that we don't get collisions. We have to make sure that we know where all our spacecraft are, and that can only be done, I think, by a kind of outward proactive approach, people engaging with a community rather than a sort of one-to-one bilateral basis.
Do you find that there is that will to collaborate, share, consider this as one Earth almost? Or do you find that it's very competitive and it's slowly shifting towards nobody wanting to share, which contributes to the problem of more pollution in space?
I think there's a balance between the two. It depends who you talk to. On the one hand, you have, let's look at Starlink and Project Kuiper. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, two people who have the independent financial capability, to launch these constellations of, thousands of satellites. On the other hand, you have the United Nations and the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and their attempt to come up with a series of internationally agreed guidelines on the long-term sustainability of the uses of outer space. And so there's a tension between these two. Obviously, the financial entrepreneurs can move more quickly, but they represent in this case one particular country. On the other hand, you have the international community who are trying to collectively come up with a set of rules, if you like, to govern this. But because you've got so many countries, it's a complicated business. I think what will happen is a sort of merger between the two somewhere in the middle. But overall, human beings, regrettably, are not terribly good at addressing issues such as this. Whether it's space debris, whether it's multiple satellites in orbit, whether it's global warming, anything that is not immediately urgent. Excuse me. Or can be delayed a little bit, tends to get delayed a little bit because there are vested interests.
So, going back, a couple of interesting questions that I had about space. How did you get so fascinated to join the Interplanetary Society when you were 18 years old, you said? Why not just focus on school, other types of activities? What was your goal going into university and specifically this industry?
Well, for me, it probably all goes back to when I was 9 years old. Before that time, I had a bunch of different ideas about what I might want to do in life. But when I was 9, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and that was a very important moment for me. The fact that I could look up at the moon and think that there were people there, and that got me very interested in space. Initially, I was more interested in astronomy and cosmology and the very, very big pictures of things. So I joined my local astronomy society. I had my own telescope, and when I went to university, I did a physics degree. And after I did the physics degree, I did a space physics master's. And it was during the space physics master's I realized that I was more interested in the engineering aspects than I was in the physics aspects. Ideally, I'd like to go to space, but if I couldn't go to space, then I was quite interested in building things that would go to space for me. And so I did my PhD in spacecraft engineering. And so I've moved from sort of physics into engineering, and I exist somewhere on the kind of on the interface between those two. And then more broadly, given my current job at the International Space University, ISU is an interdisciplinary institution. So although people may think that we're primarily about science or engineering, we're not. Science is part of what we do. Engineering is part of what we do. The applications of space also, but so is space management and business, space policy, space economics, space law, the human aspects of space flight, physical, physiological, psychological, how do you select astronauts, how do you train them, and also, the space humanities, space art, space poetry, space ethics, all those things are part of space. And so nowadays I call myself, slightly humorously, but actually more seriously, a spaceist. I'm interested in all aspects of space. Because of my background, I tend to focus on the scientific and technical aspects, but I really am interested in space as a whole, and that's why I have stayed involved with the British Interplanetary Society. And I guess why now I'm their president-elect.
Have you actually gone into space already? Or I assume space is from 50,000 feet, right? So have you gone with an airplane into space or something?
Regrettably, I've never been into space. I mean, there's a little bit of discussion about where space starts, but at the moment, I would say the general agreement is it starts at 100 kilometers, the so-called von Karman line. 50,000 feet is not really space. So no, I've never been into space. 30 years ago, I applied to be an astronaut on what was then the Anglo-Russian Juno program, which was a privately funded enterprise to send a British person to the Mir space station for a week. I got to a candidate about 25, I think. Unfortunately, my left nostril is not of very good quality. I didn't know that beforehand.
Wait, and so your left nostril? What
my left nostril, yes. Where it goes through the skull, because obviously when your nostril goes through the skull, there has to be a hole in the skull. The hole is too small. There's still a hole. But, I mean, the point is that they had a group of people and they had to down select. They had to find reasons to get rid of people. So, that was me, gone. Because that had also affected the sinuses on the left side of my face. Nothing to be done about it. Doesn't mean that I couldn't be an astronaut, but it does mean that I'm not as good as the person who doesn't have, that condition. So in the end, they chose Helen Sharman, and she went to the Mir space station for a week and did a very good job. Of course, I would have been very happy if it was me, but I'm equally happy that Helen, as a female scientist, got to go, because she proved to be an excellent role model for many people interested in science, and also for many women. So I'm happy that she went.
Do you think that as we progress and space, the way we access space evolves, that it will become easier to access space as a normal person, or will it always be as strict as, for instance, disqualifying people with the wrong nostril?
Oh no, it's bound to get easier. I mean, in the case of throwing me out because my left nostril was not very good, they had, I mean, for the Juno selection, they had 13,000 applications, which they then reduced down, and then they got it to what they called the long list of 150, and they did some basic medical and psych tests, and then they got it down to the final 35. But the point is, you have to get it down to the final two, the person who's going to fly and their backup. And so you have to find a reason to get rid of people in that situation, because you only have the money to fly one person. Once it gets easier to go to space, once space becomes more democratic, then other people can go to space. I mean, since then we've seen a bunch of people go to the International Space Station as space tourists, or private spaceflight participants, as they prefer to be called, and that was probably the cost of maybe about $25 million a ticket, which is an enormous amount of money for most of us. But the point is, it means you didn't have to be a NASA astronaut. If you had the money, you could go. And now we're in a situation again with SpaceX and Axiom Space being able to offer flights. So we have the Inspiration 4 mission coming up. We have the Axiom missions. The price has gone up a bit. Yeah, I don't know if that's inflation over time, but now the price that is bandied around is $55 million. So if you have $55 million, you can go to space with SpaceX. And there are other organisations. I'm, for the sake of full transparency, I'm an unpaid advisor to an activity called Space Hero. And if this all works out, this is going to be a global reality TV show, and the prize will be a flight to the International Space Station. So it is becoming easier for people to go to space. It's still not as easy as buying a plane ticket, for sure, but at least it's possible. This idea of from imagination to reality is closing that gap, and as time goes on, more private citizens will go to space. Yeah, for sure. And initially, it will be the people who are the rich people. I mean, that's the way it is. But nevertheless, that means you don't have to be a career astronaut, or you don't have to be in the military. You can go to space just because you want to, if you can afford it. And I think that's an excellent thing. Space, it is a wonderful domain, but it should be for as many people as possible. It shouldn't be reserved just for a small select group.
I would love to have your opinion on how you see the future of space, and more specifically on how it's evolved since I would say Elon Musk with SpaceX entered the picture. Do you think it'll go much faster? Do you think it'll take still many years before the democratization of space happens? What do you think about the plans of Mars and beyond? Pretty much, what is your opinion on the future of space and what's happening?
Okay, well, it's always going to be difficult to get to space compared to staying on Earth, because that's physics. You can't break the laws of physics. You need a lot of energy to get to space. So you're always going to need to find a way to deliver that sort of energy. But what I think Elon Musk has done with SpaceX is to reduce the cost of that significantly. And assuming that he is successful with Starship, what we're going to see is a reusable system which is capable of delivering very large payloads to space much more cheaply than it was possible in the past. I mean, in the last week, SpaceX has been selected by NASA to be, the company responsible for the human landing system for going to the moon, and if that is done using the Starship, the amount of payload, the amount of mass, the amount of equipment that can be delivered to the surface of the moon is going to be much, much larger than we've ever been able to do in the past. And that opens up all sorts of possibilities. At the same time, even if you don't want to go to the moon, just being able to deliver large amounts of stuff to Earth orbit cheaply will enable all sorts of other possibilities. And of course, everybody focuses on SpaceX and Elon Musk because he's also doing Teslas and other fun things with solar power, the Starlink internet satellites. But there are other players as well. Jeff Bezos, he has been funding his company Blue Origin, and they are slowly developing their launch vehicles. They've taken a slightly different route. They've decided to focus initially on suborbital flights with their New Shepard vehicles. They did a launch last week, and very soon they'll be flying suborbital space tourists. They're working on bigger rockets. Jeff Bezos has a vision for space, somewhat different from Elon Musk's, but it is about people living and working in Earth orbit. And the motto of Blue Origin is Gradatim Velociter, which means basically making progress slowly but surely. And Blue Origin has always been much more reserved, if you like, compared to SpaceX, which is out there, lots of publicity. Which one of them will be successful, or whether they will both be successful, time will tell. But the point is, there are people who have this vision, who are looking to develop, the ability to go to space and to do things in space. Last weekend, for example, a documentary came out called The High Frontier, and this was remembering another space pioneer, Jerry O'Neill, who back in the 1970s created this concept of the high frontier. And certainly for people of my age, and I know Jeff Bezos was influenced by this when he was young as well, it was this vision of human beings going to space, using space resources, building enormous, space structures that people could live in, and effectively colonizing the solar system. And I think the common thing between the vision of Elon Musk and the vision of Jeff Bezos is you have to get human beings off Earth, whether they're going to live in space stations, according to Bezos, whether they're going to live on the surface of Mars, according to Musk. Okay, they have different visions there, but what they share is this desire to get as many people as possible from Earth and into space.
Do you think they are collaborating, all these companies, or do you think it's so competitive that these companies are not sharing or wanting to share secrets between each other?
Well, I'm absolutely sure that Blue Origin and SpaceX are not collaborating. They have way too much competition between the two and the approach. In other areas, there's plenty of scope for collaboration. Because when you look away from SpaceX and Blue Origin, these two enormous companies, and you come down to the smaller space companies, there's different ones who are looking to populate different parts of the niche. So there are some companies, for example, who are working on small space launch vehicles. There are some people who are looking at small satellites to deliver particular services in space. There are some people who are looking at orbital maneuvering vehicles to move things around in space. There are other people, say, looking at laser communication devices between satellites and the ground. And so there are people looking at all these different niches within the bigger space ecosystem, and seeing where they fit. And the really exciting thing at the moment is that there are so many of them. I mean, they won't all be successful, I'm sure, but we, as the human race, don't need all of them to be successful. We just need some of them to be successful, and that will be transformative.
I have a question that I don't see many people raise when all these, SpaceX's and Blue Origins are talking about populating space. We are very well protected on planet Earth. Everything is just perfect for life. The moment you leave, and go into space, all that protection goes away. So radiation becomes a problem. All these issues creep up. Do you think it is possible with technology to solve these issues?
Certainly space is a partially hostile environment. I mean, it's not where human beings evolved. I think I have to, say that Earth is not perfect for humans as well. I mean, yes, it's where we evolved, but there are plenty of things which can disrupt life on Earth. I think asteroid impacts are fairly well known now. I mean, 20 years ago, people didn't really understand the implications of asteroid impacts, but we know that every so often the Earth will get hit by an asteroid, and when it does, it can be incredibly destructive. And if we were very unlucky, a big enough asteroid could wipe out all human life on Earth. It's one of the reasons for not having everybody living on the Earth, for why we need to move off Earth. So I think that technological solutions for some of the problems that we face in space are possible. I think that's true. I think it's maybe not always as straightforward as some people think. I would say, Elon Musk has this idea of, yes, let's transport people to Mars. But what happens when you drop all these people on Mars? seems to be, well, that's not really, his concern. And I don't think it will do us any good if we take all these people to Mars and then they die. And I think there are concerns about certainly life on other planets. I mean, for instance, on Mars, the particular dust environment is very, very important. It's a very dry environment. You get these things called fines, very small, sharp dust particles, which I suspect, if breathed into human lungs, would not be at all good for human beings. I don't think they'd be terribly good for machines. But as yet, we have no knowledge, we have no information about these. We haven't brought any samples back from Mars, and possibly I'm too cautious. But for me, it seems that we should be investigating that sort of thing before we send people there for extended periods of time. It's one thing to send astronauts there and bring them back, but if we're talking about sending settlers there to stay there, I think we should have a clearer idea of what they may be facing.
Do you think that if humans would go to Mars, they'd have to live underground to be safe? Or do you think there are other solutions when you go to another planet like that?
Well, I'm sure it's incredibly dangerous. I don't see how it could be anything other, really. I mean, even if on Earth you go from one place to another and taking only very limited equipment with you, that could be a dangerous situation. If you're moving to a completely new environment which you have very little knowledge of, that's bound to be dangerous. And so then it comes down to a matter of opinion about what level of danger one is prepared to accept, but also not just personally, but also what level of danger we are prepared to allow other people to accept. Is it moral, is it ethical to send somebody off on a trip to Mars if you think there's a good chance they will die? I mean, one point of view is it's down to them, it's their decision. If they want to go, you should let them go. On another point of view, it's, well, I think they might die and I'm not sure they really do understand the challenges. It's about informed consent. And the question is, how can you be sure about how informed that consent is? And I don't have an answer for that question. I think it's a complicated issue, but it's one that we need to address. I know that, for example, at least one part of the Islamic world has sort of ruled that a mission to Mars would not be permissible because it's effectively a suicide mission, and suicide is not permissible. Yes, I'm afraid I don't have the reference for you, but I know that there was that ruling from at least one particular part of the Islamic world that said missions to Mars, can't do those because effectively it's a suicide mission. That said, at the same time, the United Arab Emirates, has a 100-year plan to send human beings to Mars. So maybe, if you have enough time and you have enough information and you have enough tech development, you can send people to Mars and it's not a suicide mission. I mean, of course, this is all a matter of, judgment, whether something is a suicide mission or not. But it does show some of the kind of human complexities, the cultural complexities on human spaceflight in particular, that go beyond any of the scientific and technical issues.
What are some of the most fascinating problems right now in space that you're maybe teaching or you see your students or colleagues working on?
Well, at the International Space University, we tend to divide space activities very broadly into two sorts. There are what we call the looking outwards ones, the ones that look out from Earth, off into space, space exploration, traveling to other planets and so on. And then there's ones which are looking back, the ones that are of benefit to everybody who lives on the Earth. And that's quite a useful model for looking at space activities. So in terms of the challenges for those looking back, I mean, you've already raised some of those. If you have all these satellites orbiting the Earth, delivering internet from space, American ones, Chinese ones, other ones, how do you manage that? We don't have a solution for that yet. So that is a big challenge, not a technical challenge. It's a policy, it's a legal challenge. Similarly, if you want to go to the moon and use the resources of the moon for financial gain, space mining, asteroid mining, how do you do that in a way that is agreed by everybody, in the world? Some parts of the world will say, well, this is the rich nations once again, jumping on the bandwagon. They will be there before us. They will extract all the resources. We can't get there. How is this fair? And I think that's another very interesting question. Again, the legal regime for resource exploitation. I mean, there are 3 countries in the world that have now passed national legislation to allow companies based in those countries to run commercial missions. The USA, Luxembourg, and the United Arab Emirates. What about the other countries in the world? How are we going to manage this? What does it mean if you live in a small developing nation and you can see these other countries going to the moon and using the resources there? Can you ever hope to connect with that? Can that ever hope to be of benefit for you? These are all issues, and from my perspective, I think these are probably more fundamental than a lot of these scientific and technical issues. I'm confident that given money and resources, we can solve the scientific and technical issues, the majority of them. But the policy, the human issues, I think are much more complicated.
Okay, I have 2 questions there that pop up. The first one is, I wasn't aware of Luxembourg. Could you explain more what the role of Luxembourg is in space nowadays? And second is, how would you propose to maybe solve, from your perspective, or how do you think it might get solved, considering how many countries there are? Could you answer the first one maybe first?
Okay, well, in terms of Luxembourg, Luxembourg is an interesting country. It's a small country in Europe, a very small country, and for part of its history, really, it was a coal mining and steel, country, and that's what it was known for. And it wasn't a terribly wealthy country at that point. But then, back in the late 70s, early 1980s. It took a decision that satellite communications was going to be a very, very important, future business market. And basically it took a big national bet on that. And it put a lot of national money into developing that. And the company SES has its headquarters in Luxembourg, and that's one of the 2 biggest satellite communication companies in the world. And it won that bet, and consequently it became a very wealthy country. I mean, not just because of that, it also does a lot now in financial services. But so it took that bet on space, and it took that bet on satellite communications, and it won that bet. And then over the last decade or so, it's been looking for another space bet, if you like. And in this area, it's been looking at space resources, asteroids, the moon, solar power. And that is why it's one of the countries that has, actually passed this national legislation. And in fact, this week, as we talk, if I wasn't, in this meeting with you, I would be taking part in the Luxembourg Space Resources Week online. Jointly with the European Space Agency, and they have just established ESRIC, the European Space Resources Centre in Luxembourg, And so Luxembourg has again taken this bet on space, both in terms of financial investment in companies, investment in their university, investment in other activities, that space resources is going to be a big area in the future, and that if they are one of the first countries into it, that they will profit very significantly. And so that's currently the role of Luxembourg in the space domain. It's a small country geographically, but it has a lot of impact internationally and in space.
What can I imagine with space resources? You're saying they're taking a big bet. Last bet took 2 decades to pay off. What is this next big bet? What can I imagine with space resources? Would they send robots to asteroids to mine diamonds or something? What am I imagining with that?
Well, the interesting thing about space resources is that it's changed a bit over the decades. I mean, space resources and the utilization of them is not a new idea. It's been around for 50 years. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke, who I mentioned earlier, the science fiction writer and former president of the British Interplanetary Society, proposed the use of space resources. I guess until maybe 10 years ago, it was focused on the idea mostly of asteroid mining and of extracting metals, and in particular platinum iridium group metals, and returning them to Earth. That has changed over the last 10 years, though, and now the focus is more on water. And there are 2 reasons, I think, for this. One, the fact that water has been discovered at the south pole of the moon. We don't have any actual local survey information, but we're very clear that there is water there in various forms, and so that can be exploited. And secondly, I think an understanding that, at least at the moment, the processing of, if you like, mineral-based resources in micro/zero gravity would be very complicated. So now what you're seeing is interest in the extraction of water, either from the moon or potentially from asteroids, for use in space. And the use of water in space is manifold. I mean, obviously, if you have human beings in space, they can drink the water. But more than that, you can split the water into hydrogen and oxygen and use it in a chemical rocket engine, or give the oxygen to human beings to breathe. Or if you just have the water on its own, you can use that in a form of electrical propulsion called a resistor jet, where you electrically heat water, I mean, similar basically to a kettle, and use that to propel spacecraft in orbit. Now, the emphasis of space resources is more on space resources for doing things in space, rather than for bringing things back to the surface of the Earth. It's a space resources for enabling activities in space. So the jargon is ISRU, in situ resource utilization, using the resources there. So if you go to the surface of the moon and you want to build a moon base, for example, you might scoop up the surface material, what they call the regolith, and using a variety of potential technologies, I mean, microwave is one of them, you might sort of use this to make bricks, to make it solid, so that you could build your structures on the surface of the moon out of these, rather than have to carry them from the surface of the Earth.
How realistic is all of this in the next 10 years if you look at SpaceX's timeline?
Well, that's, I mean, if I had a good answer to that question, I would probably be in a position to become significantly more wealthy. I mean, I guess looking at SpaceX and looking at Starship going to the moon, I don't think we're going to put human beings on the moon by 2024, which was the predicted Artemis period. But I think we will do it by 2026, shall we say. And if you have one of those Starship vehicles going to the moon, one of the interesting things there is just how much payload, how much mass it can take there, and that will enable a lot of things. I mean, you can almost take a bulldozer to the moon. I mean, at the moment, every time you put something into space, you're trying to reduce the mass as much as possible because it's so difficult. And if Starship comes off, this will enable us to take much bigger pieces of equipment to the moon, which will enable us to do many more things. So I think if I had to predict, 10 years from now, I think we'll see some very interesting things going on the moon with some big pieces of equipment. I can't be terribly specific at this point, but that's my feel about the way things are going. And we will start to see, as a result, space resources on the moon, used in new and interesting ways. So that, it's a bit of a hand-waving description of the next decade, but that's what I expect.
I have maybe a very basic question, but how big is the moon if we would compare it to countries? Because obviously we're taught in school the moon is smaller than the Earth, but I can imagine it's still pretty big.
Well, no, it's well. If you take, I don't have an exact comparison for you, but if you compare the surface area of the moon to the surface area of the Earth, it's pretty small. One has to be realistic about about the comparisons. We're not talking about an entire new planet, the size of the Earth. But on the plus side, the Earth is 70% covered in water, and only 30% covered, in land. It's a good question. I don't know the direct comparison there. I'm sure somebody on the internet has looked, has done that comparison. I'm sure if you Google it, you find the answer very quickly, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
I wanted to ask you about your opinion on the other ways of utilizing spaceships. So, for instance, I saw, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe, the commercial that SpaceX released for the Starship, where you could use the Starship almost like an airliner, and it would take you in 30 minutes to any point in the world. What is your opinion, and how realistic is something like that?
Well, yeah, I remember seeing Elon announce that at one of the big space conferences. I mean, technically, if you have Starship, it's doable. It's what we call a suborbital flight. It's something in low Earth orbit goes around the world every 90 minutes. So to go halfway around the world would take 45 minutes. So if you have a big enough rocket, you can be somewhere else in the world in 30 to 45 minutes. I guess my question would be, how economically feasible would it be? I'm of an age that I remember the Anglo-French Concorde project, the supersonic jetliner which used to fly across the Atlantic, and there were clearly, obviously, some people who were rich enough, for whatever reason, either business or personally, to want to fly Concorde and to get across the Atlantic in that time. But it was fairly clear that once Concorde was coming towards the end of its operational life, that none of the airlines considered it to be sufficiently profitable to want to say, let's have another equivalent of Concorde. So the question there for me is not a technical question really. It's about the business case. Are there enough people? Is there enough business? Is there enough value added to do that? And I think that's particularly interesting in the current situation of the coronavirus pandemic. For the last year and a bit, many people in the world have not traveled. And we've all learnt to use electronic communication systems, instead. and I don't know how that's going to affect the future of current air travel. The airlines that I used to travel with, keep sending me emails saying, come on back, please fly with us. And trying to give me incentives to fly. And I don't know how they're going to do. So the question is, for me, is how long would it take us to get to a situation where there was enough of a need that enough people would pay the premium price to travel that quickly, and also, of course, how safe it would be, relative to more normal air travel. I mean, you'd have to make it very, very safe. Even if you lost one rocket in 100, I suspect people would be a bit reluctant to use that to go on holiday, or even on work.
Wouldn't that first bit, though, be an argument for the Starship? Because airplanes, let's say I would fly to China right now. I remember I flew to China a couple of years ago. With connection flights, took me like 12 hours to get there.
Oh yeah.
But now we're in this virtual world. Everybody's used to just instantly connecting with people. So that 30-minute travel time to the middle of China would be almost like an argument for our society instead of these 12-hour flights. I feel like most people would then choose a Starship rather than an airplane.
I think in terms of climate impact, it depends on the relative climate impact. It depends on how many kilograms, how many metric tons of carbon dioxide one is putting into the atmosphere to do the different journeys. And although although flying by Starship may be much quicker, that doesn't mean that it uses or produces less environmental impact. Arguably, if you walk, if you can, from one place to another, that has very little environmental impact. And so sometimes going slower is better. It's our desire to get to places quickly, that creates the environmental impact. And I think one of the interesting things will be to see post-coronavirus pandemic how people react. I mean, for instance, I've seen reports that in terms of international air travel, something like 90% of the environmental impact is created by 10% of the traveling people. There are some people, yes, who get on a plane once a year, maybe to go on vacation. They don't really contribute much to the global impact. It's the other people, that small number of people who are traveling all the time, who are having the most impact. And I guess those are the sort of people who are more likely to be buying something like a Starship suborbital flight from New York to Sydney. And then the question is, one, do they change their habits, and two, how much are they prepared to pay to get from New York to Sydney in half an hour? And that's as a scientist engineer, that's a bit beyond my capability to determine. Interesting question, though.
I definitely want to go into the environmental bit of it. That was a question I wanted to ask for sure. Before we do, though, from a technical perspective, do you think a normal person who already, for instance, like me, I'm getting pretty sick if there's a little bit of turbulence on an airplane, is it even reasonable to expect that someone like me would be able to do a suborbital flight?
I think so. I mean, the takeoff and the landing phases would both be, a bit hard. I guess it depends a bit on what exactly it is that upsets you in turbulence. It's one of those things. I mean, again, astronauts get this when they go into space. My understanding is that it's caused by, if you like, a kind of cognitive disconnect between what one set of body sensors is experiencing, being shaken around, and what the eyes see, a bit like being seasick. And the one thing you can say for a suborbital flight is, even if you do feel a bit of upset, it's not going to last very long. So in my life, I've got sick in a number of situations. I've never felt sick on an airplane. I've felt sick on a bus from time to time when I happened to be sitting over the back axle and it was going up and down. When I've been to a theme park and I've been on some of the rides there, those have made me feel sick, as well from time to time.
Is it worse than a roller coaster, a suborbital flight? What can I imagine with that?
I to be honest, I don't know. We have very little experience of actual suborbital flights. In the early days of spaceflight, Yuri Gagarin did a suborbital flight. Alan Shepard and the US and John Glenn did suborbital flights. But since then, most of the flights have been up into space and orbital. So at the moment, I don't think we really have an answer for that question. But it's an important one because, if I set up, Welch suborbital airlines, and then all the passengers who fly on it just go, well, I felt as sick as a dog, for the entire flight. I got there quickly, but I didn't enjoy it. That's not going to really encourage a whole lot of people to take suborbital flights unless they have to. It's interesting. Another community, if you like, who are interested in suborbital flights is the military. And I know that in the US, the Pentagon has had some discussions with SpaceX about, if you like, suborbital delivery of troops. Because you can see, if you're a military power, the possibility to move soldiers from one part of the planet to another part of the planet in a very short period of time is strategically and tactically very useful. Now you can imagine the U.S. Marines. Okay, if they get in a rocket and they feel sick for 45 minutes, well, that's you're in the Marines now. That's what you put up with. It's a whole different thing from if you're a family off on vacation, and your kids are all feeling incredibly sick as the first part of the vacation. I think this remains to be seen. I don't have a good answer for it. Until we start flying humans on more suborbital flights, I don't think we will know.
So what about the environmental aspect? The thing that I wanted to ask there is, are there technologies being developed right now, both in space as well as maybe airplanes? I don't know if you'd be able to answer that. That would switch away from, obviously, the huge waste that we're producing right now. Isn't there like electric airplanes or electric spaceships, or I don't know what I can imagine with those things?
I can give some sort of answer to that. I'm not really the right person to talk about electric aircraft. I know there's work going on in that area, but it's things that fly around in the atmosphere. I'm kind of less interested in because I'm about getting to space. But that said, in terms of the space community engaging with the environment, there are a couple of aspects to that. One is obviously the use of satellites to monitor the environment, and that's a very important part of what people in the space sector do. And I think overall you will find many of the people who work in the space sector are effectively environmentalists, because they are used to seeing the planet as a whole planet. They don't see it country by country. They say, here is a whole planet and these are the physical processes affecting it, and we need to be sensible and make good decisions about how we treat the planet. Otherwise we could end up damaging it a lot. And we can use satellites to monitor that and to give us information, and then hopefully persuade the politicians to make sensible decisions. that's monitoring from orbit. If we look about getting to space, it's certainly true. I mean, one can't deny it. Every time one launches a rocket and it goes off through the atmosphere, it has an environmental impact. Similarly to the way that every time one takes a plane, it has an environmental impact. The question is how many of these and what impact do they have? Ultimately, the really civilized way to get to space is not to use a rocket at all. The civilized way to get to space is to use what's called an orbital elevator, which was first conceived by the Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, but also used by Arthur C. Clarke in his science fiction book, The Fountains of Paradise, where...
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, effectively, you go by lift. So you go to the equator, and on the equator there is this big tower that goes up tens of thousands of kilometers into the sky, and you get in a lift. And the lift, it may take hours to get there, but you just go up and up and up. Okay, you still have to generate the electricity to power this, but the point is you're not necessarily putting gases into the atmosphere. Yeah, you could generate the power, by wind power. Put it onto batteries and then power the lift that way. So ultimately, in my opinion, that's the really civilized way to get to space is to not to use rockets at all.
Wait, that sounds like science fiction to me. How is that feasible?
Well, it is science
to have
fiction.
Such an elevator?
No, well, at the moment it is science fiction, but there are people looking at it. There's a number of organisations and groups around the world who believe, in the orbital elevator. I mean, to come back to the British Interplanetary Society again, established in 1933, saying that it is possible to travel into space using rockets, and everyone went, yeah, you're crazy, not possible. And then, in 1957, first satellite, in 1961, first human in space. So not so crazy after all. So there's always room for visionaries, and there's nothing in terms of space elevators that contradicts the laws of physics. Okay, the question is, how do you manage the engineering? Okay, and that's the thing. So it's not like interstellar warp drive, from one star to another in 5 seconds. That as far as we know, we can't do. That contradicts the currently understood laws of physics. Now, an orbital elevator doesn't contradict the laws of physics. It's just really, really difficult engineering. We don't have the materials that are strong enough for it. We don't have the control systems to control all aspects of the elevator. But over time we could work towards that, and that would mean that you could send things up into space, without all these rockets, and that would be a much more civilized and have potentially much less impact on the environment than using rockets. Now, if you ask me when might I expect to see an orbital elevator, that's a difficult question. My orbital elevator friends probably won't thank me, but I would say 30 to 50 years.
That's still a short time. I mean, I understand technology grows, but 30 years in order to have an elevator that goes to space?
Well, all these things depend very much on how one sees technology developing. And from my point of view, for the orbital elevator, there are two aspects. There is the materials aspect as one important thing, the strength of materials. And then there is the control aspect. How do you control this long, thin structure? The control aspect, I think, can be managed computationally. The better the computers you have, the easier it will get. And computational capability is one of those things that's been, ramping up massively, exponentially over decades, with Moore's law. So for me, the primary question is the strength of the materials, and that's a bit more difficult to predict. But my feeling is, looking at progress in materials technology, looking at carbon-based compounds, looking at other I don't know, artificial diamonds and so on. I think within 30 to 50 years we could at least have the materials that would make this possible. Of course, then you need the political, financial will to actually implement the project. At the moment, I think we don't have the material strength, or the control systems, but these are technical problems. As I say, it doesn't contradict the laws of physics. It's doable with the right technology. So we should get on and develop the technology.
The elevator sounds like it makes sense if you have those two things in place. But what about actual rockets right now? You said at one point we could use water split up into hydrogen. Is it not an idea to switch rockets to something that doesn't emit so much CO2?
Well, carbon dioxide is not the only thing. I mean, the space shuttle, for example, the space shuttle main engine used liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and that's a really good propulsion system. And when you burn liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, you get very high performance and you get water. Okay, no carbon dioxide at all. Okay, there were the solid rocket boosters, on the side of the space shuttle as well. And you can imagine whether it's a rocket or whether it's a space plane that uses liquid hydrogen and then gathers oxygen from the atmosphere as it flies up. In both cases, the exhaust is water, and you might think, oh, water, that's fine, but actually, it's not quite that straightforward. You can do damage to the environment without putting carbon dioxide in. Carbon dioxide certainly contributes to the global warming crisis. There's no doubt about that. But if you look at what are the implications of effectively injecting water vapor into the Earth's atmosphere at various altitudes above the surface of the Earth, that can do damage as well. The Earth's atmosphere is not a stable mixture of gases. I mean, down towards the surface of the Earth, it's more stable, but as you go up, it's if you like, it's a reactive soup. You have this set of gases. You have these photons coming in from the sun, different sorts of electromagnetic radiation. This causes a whole variety of photochemical reactions. And so you've got a lot of chemicals that are constantly transforming from one thing to another thing. And if you then dump a whole load of water into that, you change the balance completely. And so even if you have a launch system that doesn't produce carbon dioxide, you can still affect the environment by putting stuff into it that's not normally there. And so it's not as simple as just the carbon dioxide. If we had space shuttles launching at the rate that they had originally planned, one every 2 weeks from the Kennedy Space Center, that would have probably been an environmental disaster, because it would have damaged the upper atmosphere very, very significantly. So one needs to take the bigger picture when one's looking at the environment. Quite understandably and quite correctly, at the moment there's a lot of focus on global warming, and that is absolutely something that has to be sorted out, because otherwise we risk damaging the planet incredibly badly. But rocket launches, if they are repeated in large numbers from one location, have the potential to do equivalent damage to many, many airplane flights. It's just that hasn't been a concern in the past.
So is it a concern now, and how do people stop the damage?
It's not a concern so far because we haven't done enough of it. But from my point of view, this is typical human behavior. We start doing something new. We do a bit of damage and we go, oh, but it's only a little damage, and we're not doing it very often. And then, some years later on, we go, you know what, we've been doing this quite a lot for a long period of time. And you know what, I think we're starting to do damage. And whether that is, in your waste heap, in your, wherever it is you live, where, all your rubbish has been taken away and buried in a hole in the ground, or whether it's in rocket launches, or whether it's in the damage that we're doing to the environment through carbon dioxide emission, it's the same thing. Humans start off thinking this is not a problem, and then they go, you know what, actually we just realized it is a problem. I mean, plastics is another thing. I mean, in the last year or two, microplastics have come to the fore. People knew that plastics were not ideal, but they hadn't realized in terms of environmental impact just how invidious they were, how they would spread out through the terrestrial ecosystems, and these nanoparticles would implant themselves in so many different situations. And now we're suddenly going, oh, plastic, and another problem to fix. And so whether it's plastics on Earth or space debris in orbit, it's another problem that human beings have created, without thinking about it. And it seems to be, unfortunately, one of those things that human beings do. They don't always give enough thought up front to the problems they might be causing.
That's definitely true. I had a question. We have a lot of young listeners as well sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a question. If somebody is listening still in university or going to university, and they really want to go down this path of becoming an astronaut, going into space, what kind of education would they have to do? What kind of careers would they have to follow? Which companies to follow? Could you shed some light on that?
Well, if you want to be an astronaut, I mean, there are two ways to be an astronaut. One is to be a career astronaut, which means it's your job. And the other way of being an astronaut is to be a private astronaut, which means you're effectively a passenger. So if I take the second one first, if you want to be a passenger astronaut, a private spaceflight participant or a space tourist, then the key thing is that you're rich, and so you need to make a whole chunk of money. So if you want to fly to the International Space Station at the moment, it will cost you $55 million. So hopefully that price will come down. But let's assume that if you want to do that in the future, as a tourist, shall we say, you're going to need $10-20 million. So find yourself a way of making that sort of money, however you do it. If you want a job as an astronaut, well, historically, to be a professional astronaut, you had to work for a space agency. Now that is starting to change. Okay, we're starting to see private astronauts. For instance, the company Axiom, in the US, that employs former NASA astronauts as private astronauts. So if you want to be a career astronaut, at the moment, the primary route is to have a background in science, technology, engineering, medicine, those sort of areas. And then also to have having a flying license or anything to do with aviation also helps a lot. What I would call operational expertise. So the sort of job where you've had to solve problems in real time in the field, because that's part and parcel of what an astronaut does. So those sort of activities. So those sort of things will certainly help. I mean, there's no guarantee. I mean, the European Space Agency has recently opened up its astronaut application process. I understand they're expecting something like 30 to 50,000 applications, and I'm sure the majority of those people who apply any of them would be well qualified to be astronauts. But at the end of the day, they have to reduce this number of 30 to 50,000 down to just a few, and so they have to find reasons to reject people. And in the same way as when I applied, I got rejected for my left nostril. it won't be that any of the people who apply couldn't actually be astronauts. It's just, they're going to pick the people who are, right absolutely at the top, which is, potentially why it may be better to make lots of money and to fly as an astronaut as a private participant, because then it's just to do with you and your money. I'm fairly sure that even with my defective left nostril, if I had $55 million and I said to SpaceX or Axiom, I want to go to space, they wouldn't say to me, "Oh, sorry, Chris, your nostril can't go." They go, "Give us the money and you're up there," and that's what's going to change as time goes forward. The restrictions on where you can't be an astronaut will gradually reduce. But in the meantime, as a professor, as you might expect, I will say, well, if you're young, and you're at school or university, you have to study hard, you have to get good qualifications, you have to get experience in as many different areas as possible. If you can learn to fly or glide or parachute, or if you can do anything medical, all those things will help, but none of them will guarantee it. All you can do is try and shift those odds a little bit in your favor, and then you need to be lucky.
So outside of the educational part, is there also, I don't know, of course, because I haven't looked it up to be an astronaut, what it is, or gone through a selection process, but is there also a physical aspect to it? Do you have to have a great condition or not be overweight? I don't know.
There are physical requirements. I mean, that is certainly the case. If you are not healthy enough, or if there were other reasons you couldn't fly, you couldn't be an astronaut. One of the interesting things that I think about the European astronaut selection is that the former head of ESA, Jan Werner, was very clear while he was in office that they were going to have a separate call, for astronauts for astronaut candidates who normally one wouldn't expect. Disabled astronaut candidates, for example, and I think this can make quite a lot of sense. There was a distinguished British space scientist who I used to know, who said, really in space you don't need your legs. I mean, what purpose are legs? They're just extra mass. They get in the way. You need arms. He said the only purpose for having legs, if you could have hands on the end of your legs, that might be useful. But if you can't have hands on the end of your legs, why do you need legs? They're just, you're floating around. Legs just, they're just a nuisance. And so I'm interested to see what will come out of the ESA astronaut selection. I'm hoping that we will see, somebody who previously might not have ever been considered, as an astronaut will be considered. I mean, clearly there will still be, there will be some limitations. But again, I'm looking forward to the to the range of people who can be astronauts being expanded. Eyesight used to be one of those things. For example, in the early days of the US program, one had to have perfect eyesight. But then as the program went on, as when some of the astronauts got older, they allowed people with glasses, to fly. As long as their vision could be corrected. So I think we will see, as we get a better understanding of what is required, we will see some of these, physical constraints relaxed. The question is, how much and how quickly.
What about conditioning? Is it like an airplane where everybody can go? Does it matter as long as you can tolerate the shaking? Or will you actually have to have some type of conditioning to be an astronaut?
Well, different people react to spaceflight in different ways. What's called space sickness, or more respectively, space adaptation syndrome, SAS, seems to be quite variable. When you sort of investigate people for motion sickness on the ground, doesn't necessarily mean that they will be they will get space sickness when they go up, and a certain proportion of all astronauts who go into space get space sickness. But eventually they adjust and they get used to it. The question again is just how long it takes them to adjust. So yeah, my feeling is that as we fly more and more people in space, we will get a better and better handle on the difficulties of this, and more people will be able to fly. That's certainly what I hope. That as many people as possible who want to fly can fly.
Yeah, that'd be great, especially if that Starship thing becomes economically viable. What are some interesting organizations, things happening that space enthusiasts can follow? Is there obviously someone at your level? Are you following specific newsletters or Reddit or something like that?
In terms of organisations and entities to follow, well, obviously, as somebody who joined the British Interplanetary Society when I was a student and is now the president-elect, I have to say you should all join the British Interplanetary Society. Check that out, www.bis-space.com. So go there and join that, absolutely. Doesn't matter if you're not in Britain. I mean, it's an international organisation, so join the BIS. If you're a young person, a student, there's an organisation called SEDS, Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. That started off in the US. There are UK branches of it. There's branches in Italy and India and other places. So look to see about that. If you're in the UK, just check out UK SEDS. I used to be chair of that myself, 30-something years ago. Obviously, as somebody who works at the International Space University, I should recommend that you look at ISU programs. I run the MSc program, which is a year-long program, but if you don't want to do that, we have a summer school that runs for 9 weeks in the Northern Hemisphere summer, and another one that runs for 5 weeks in Australia in January and February. Another great organisation, the SGAC, the Space Generation Advisory Council, which is for people between 18 and 35, and that is global in scope. Runs a lot of really excellent activities, encourages its members to become involved, and there are national organisers, regional organisers for the whole globe. So check out the Space Generation Advisory Council. That's a really good organisation as well for young people. And then beyond that, in terms of the space information flow, I'm thinking about what I do each day. When I get up in the morning, I grab my phone and I check out my usual information feeds. Reddit is one of them. I don't use Reddit a whole lot, but occasionally I go to Reddit. You have to, from my perspective, you have to kind of go through a lot of stuff to kind of find the really interesting things. But I look at spacenews.com, which is the newspaper, if you like, of the space community. That's one of them. I look at Parabolic Arc, which is again a specialised space news feed. All the stories on that are to do with space, and they're very current. There's always new stuff on there every day. I also look at Ars Technica, which is not a specific space feed, but it has one of the guys who works for Ars Technica, Eric Berger, is a very good space journalist, and he also produces for Ars Technica their I think it's bi-weekly rocket review. So I'm not sure it's every week or every 2 weeks. There's a summary of what's happening in rocketry, plus a bunch of good space stories. And another good one, spaceflightnow.com, which focuses on actually things that are about to fly. That gives good coverage of those. And then, of course, the websites of the organisations themselves, the ESA website, the NASA website, SpaceX website, Blue Origin website, and so on, to track those sort of things, more directly. There's nowadays there's so much information out there, one can't possibly capture all of it. One of the reasons I joined the British Interplanetary Society way back when I was a student was because in those days there was no internet, and so the only way when I was a student to get space information was the monthly magazine. And nowadays a lot of this stuff all comes through to your phone. Even on social media, if you can find on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and other things, the right people or the right organisations to follow, you can get a lot of information through them.
Are you also aware of any big prominent investors or venture capitalists that solely invest in space startups?
Oh yeah, no. There's a bunch of venture capitalists nowadays who are particularly interested in space, and they're increasing. One of the good places to look for the venture capitalists actually at the moment is on Clubhouse. I don't know how many of your listeners will be into Clubhouse at the moment, given the fact that it's still quasi closed and only available on the Apple iPhone. But there seems to be quite a lot of interest in as they say in Clubhouse, setting up the rooms for space venture capitalists, there. And I'm still dabbling with Clubhouse myself. It's interesting. It's certainly potentially it's a good way to come into direct contact with a bunch of experts and to hear what they think. Not in the venture capitalist realm, but for instance, Jim Green, who is the chief scientist of NASA, is on Clubhouse a lot and taking part in a whole bunch of rooms, and the opportunity to, even if you don't talk to him directly, just to listen to him, to find out his opinion on things, and to hear some of the knowledge he has, is a really good opportunity. I mean, he I know Jim. He lectures at ISU, every year, and it's super popular because of his knowledge. But of course, that's a kind of once a year thing, and on Clubhouse, you get the opportunity to hear him directly. I mean, earlier this week, just before the Mars helicopter flight, I think it was like 3 a.m. or something in the US, he was there on Clubhouse talking about, the Mars program, talking about the helicopter flight, and it really gave a very direct connection to somebody very senior in NASA, in a way that you wouldn't normally expect. If you have the opportunity for Clubhouse, I would, any of the people listening, watching, I would say check it out. I'm still deciding myself, but I think it certainly has potential value.
Are there any podcasts or something that maybe you have considered starting, or one of your students or something like that?
There are quite a few space podcasts, but I must admit I don't have time to listen to them usually. And to be honest, I'm thinking about it now. You've asked me the question. The podcasts that I do listen to are actually mostly not space ones, because actually when I listen to podcasts, it's interesting now you mention it. They're sort of what I listen to for sort of non-space relaxation. When I want to, so much of my life is tied up in space. 95% of my life is space, whether it's work or hobby or leisure. It's all space, because I'm a spaceist. And so when I want to do something that's not space, I'll go and listen to a podcast. I hadn't thought about that till you asked me the question, but I think that's the way it is.
That's pretty fascinating, because when I want to relax, I listen to space episodes, podcasts, that stuff. Actually, one pops up that I just remembered, that I listened to Star Talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Have you checked that one out?
Okay. I don't know that one, but I'm sure if it's Neil deGrasse Tyson, it's really good.
Yeah. He's been doing it for very long. More before the whole podcast explosion. I mean, Star Talk has been, I think, on National Geographic and everything. It's like really long now that they've been doing it. But we're slowly starting to wrap up. I have a couple of last questions. I asked about organizations to follow. Do you have any books that inspired you? Obviously, you mentioned Arthur C. Clarke. Do you have 2, 3 books you'd recommend to our listeners, young, old, that want to get into space or are very interested in space?
Yeah, it kind of depends which aspects and what information. I mean, if you're technically minded, then and you're looking for a good book just to learn some basics of space engineering from, I would suggest Understanding Astronautics, Introduction to Space, edited by Jerry John Sellers. It's a very, very good teaching textbook. So it's not just the information; it's very well structured. The introduction to each topic, the examples, the kind of questions. So that's a particularly good book. If, on the other hand, you're the sort of person who doesn't really want to deal with equations, then there's another book called It's Only Rocket Science by Lucy Rogers, which is also a good book, which kind of describes what happens in space but without any equations at all. I mean, those are two particularly good ones that I would recognise. One for kind of the more technically minded, one for people who don't. It's a little bit old now, but if you're looking for a kind of interesting, entertaining view of space resources, John Lewis's Mining the Sky is a good book. It's relatively slim. It's intended for a popular audience, but that sets out, if you like, a kind of vision for extraterrestrial resource exploitation. And of course, if you said, pretty much any of the books by Arthur C. Clarke. I mean, they're older now. Obviously, he's died, but Profiles of the Future is a good one that originally came out in 1962, and then I think there was a 1978 version and a 1999 version that he updated. But those are all good for creating a forward-looking vision. Pretty much anything by Peter Diamandis, who was one of the founders of ISU. How to Build a Spaceship would be a good one, for example. So all of those. And then there's lots and lots of biographies by different astronauts. My favourite biography by an astronaut is probably Carrying the Fire by Mike Collins, who was the command module pilot on Apollo 11. So he got to go to the moon on the first kind of landing mission, but didn't go there. It's quite a big book, and of course it's quite old now. It goes back to the to the 1960s, but it's still one of my favourite astronaut biographies. And then probably after that, second favourite one is probably Spaceman by Mike Massimino, who is a amazing NASA astronaut, but has written a very good book about the challenges of becoming an astronaut, not just the educational challenges, but also some of the psychological challenges involved in becoming an astronaut. So that was very good too.
That's a ton of interesting books I'll be putting on my Audible list. We usually ask this question as well because it's Impact Talks. What is a project that you've experienced or you've worked on in the past that might have brought you the biggest, or the world, the biggest impact? Is there anything that really pops up throughout your entire career? We've discussed now, obviously, the beginning and what you're busy with nowadays.
Well, yes. I mean, there is, and somewhat strangely, I mean, it's actually a space art project. I've done a bunch of science and technology related things in my life, but I'm personally very keen to see space used for all sorts of purposes. And a few years ago, with a friend and colleague, a space artist called Naum, we created this space payload, an art payload that went to the International Space Station, and actually it's currently still there. He's a Mexican based in Berlin, and we had this opportunity to fly this payload. It's very small. It's a 10 by 10 by 10 cube, and it's the world's first and probably only interactive microgravity kaleidoscope. And the way it works is that somebody on the ground puts their finger on a sensor which measures their pulse, and the pulse is transmitted up to the space station into the payload, and this activates the kaleidoscope. And there are some little objects that float around in the kaleidoscope, and there's a little video camera, and then the video signal is transmitted back down to the ground. And what I like about this is that we flew some science payloads to the space station as well, and they were good. But what I like about this is it's a bit off the wall, it's very different, and it shows that space can be used not just for scientific and technical purposes. And it shows that you can do things in space that have different meanings for different communities. And I also like the fact that it's interactive. It provides a direct human connection from the ground to the space station, and back again. So that's one of my favourite projects. It should be coming back from the space station in January next year. And I'm looking forward. It's spent more than 1,000 days in space at the moment, and by the time we get it back, it will have spent 3 years in space. And I will be very pleased to have back in my hands something that has spent that long in space, and has hopefully changed people's perception about what space can be used for. It's not just about science. It's not just about technology. It's not just about doing things to make money. You can do things in space because you want to. Elon Musk, because he's a very rich man, he put a red Tesla, and launched it into space. I'm not as rich as him, but I had the opportunity to fly this payload, and as part of this payload, I put a poem that I had written in there. So we each have to adjust accordingly. But he sent a Tesla because he could. I sent a poem because I could. And I hope that in the future, many more people will be able to do things in space just because they can.
Yeah, that's a good one. Doesn't something that spends 1,000 days in the space station, doesn't that deteriorate due to radiation, or is there a lot of protection there?
No, it certainly has deteriorated, and we built it fairly cheaply. In space parlance, we used COTS, commercial off-the-shelf technology, and that means they're not space qualified. So we used a Raspberry Pi computer to control it, and various other things. And you're absolutely right. It is suffering after all that time in space. The radiation has started to damage it. The SD card that's part of it is not working in the way that it used to. And that's one of the things that we're learning is what you can get away with. How cheaply can you build a payload and still have it work? It is still working, but it's got a little bit more tricky to operate.
Interesting. I always thought that somehow, somewhere with technology, they're protecting the astronauts from radiation, but is it really just open for radiation up there?
Well, the nature of space radiation is you cannot block all of it, and so there will always be some sort of impact. People are looking at technologies, for the future. At the moment, the longest an astronaut has been to the space station is, I think a year, and we've seen some impact on the astronaut there. Obviously, if you're going to send things up that are going to be there for longer, normally you would build them out of robust components. And if you're NASA, okay, you can afford that. In our case, we couldn't afford it. The entire payload, I mean, we used 3D printing and we used some innovative techniques. I think it cost us about €3,000, the actual payload. So the payload itself was very cheap, but this shows you can do things in space cheaply, but you have to accept the fact that obviously the performance will degrade with time. It won't be so robust, and that's a decision you make. You trade off money versus risk. And for a payload, that's fine. If you're flying humans, you don't want to do that. You want to keep the humans alive. But in this case, we didn't originally plan it to be in space for this long. We planned it to be in space for a year, and then we got the opportunity to extend the mission, which of course we did. So that's why it's starting to.
What was the impact on the longest astronaut in space? You mentioned that.
Oh, I'm not. There were a variety of biomedical aspects, but I'm not the right person to ask about that. I'm a physicist-engineer. You should talk to the medics. There's one of my colleagues at ISU, and she could tell you all the information about that. I know that there were impacts, but I'm not up to speed on what all of them were. But I know that some of them were non-trivial.
I'd love to have her on the podcast, ask those questions, explore it. But no, that was definitely.
Well, I'm happy to put you in contact with her.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, sir.
That I loved it. I would like to roll out the red carpet for you. If you have anything to promote, where can people find you? Thank you so much for sharing so much content with us.
In terms of promotion, well, I'll just repeat, join the British Interplanetary Society, www.bis-space.com. That's the first thing if you like my talk. If you want to find me, you can find me on Twitter at Prof. Chris Welch, and I'm on Instagram at the same thing. And yeah, if you're looking for me on LinkedIn, you can find me on as Prof. Chris Welch there as well. So if you search online for Chris Welch and space, you'll find me. The space bit is important. If you just search for Chris Welch, you'll find the music journalist, who's a very interesting guy, but not me. So Chris Welch and space, and you'll find me.
No, I loved it. Is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners?
Just that I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions, if you have any follow up, by all means, find me on the internet and ask me, and I'll do my best to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for being on, and I think on that note we can close it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've had a great time.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here, and if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group, where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business